Do you have a paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? Send us an email with your story for a chance of it being featured on Weird World. In July 2002, Mark Romano came forward with his account of a haunting that occurred in Worth, Illinois, on Chicago's South Side. The events he documented in 1977 would challenge any skeptic's dismissal of the paranormal, involving a family whose ordinary life was disrupted by an increasingly menacing supernatural presence. As Mark emphasises, this account contains no dramatic embellishments or exaggerations, though the events themselves proved shocking enough. In 1976, a man named George purchased his first home in Worth with his wife and 4 daughters. They were, by all accounts, a normal family living normal lives. George was an honest middle-aged man with no serious problems who supplemented his day job income by running a small car repair business from his detached garage. This garage, situated in the backyard and equipped with professional tools, provided additional income for the family of 6. Its location away from the house proved ideal, as it kept the noise from his equipment from disturbing the household. For the first year, life progressed normally in their new home. The older daughters attended school, while his wife maintained the household as a full-time mother. It wasn't until early June 1977 that the first signs of something unusual began to manifest. The initial incident occurred after a night out at dinner. Upon returning home in the evening, they discovered their front door standing wide open, the television blaring at full volume, and all the lights on in the front room. This was particularly disturbing as George had been the last to leave, personally checking all the lights, the television, and locking the front door. George, exercising caution, inspected the house before allowing his family inside. He discovered the back door was also open. After the local authorities completed their investigation that evening, George made another unsettling discovery. The equipment in his garage had been mysteriously rearranged. George initially attributed these disturbances to local teenagers, reasoning that lockpicking wasn't impossible, and decided no further action was needed, as nothing had been stolen or damaged. However, this rational explanation would prove insufficient to explain the escalating strange occurrences that would soon follow. A week later, at 4 a.m, George awoke to use the bathroom when he once again discovered a similar scene. The doors were open and lights were on, but this time the television's volume was turned completely down. This was in contrast to the previous occasion, where it had been turned all the way up. Standing in his front yard in the early hours before sunrise, George surveyed the area, searching for any explanation. He methodically made his rounds, turning off lights and closing doors, deciding to wait until morning to check his garage. When he did inspect it, he found his tools undisturbed, but inexplicably non-functional for the next 3 days. The haunting took a darker turn when George began experiencing vivid nightmares of his children being attacked while he remained helpless to intervene. These dreams were so vivid that George described them as feeling absolutely real, leaving him deeply shaken. When his wife suggested the possibility of a haunting, George, like many practical men of his era, dismissed the notion. The house remained quiet for several weeks until Becky's unusual behaviour began. Life in the household followed a regular pattern, with George ensuring his youngest daughter was in bed by 9 p.m, while his teenage daughters managed their own bedtime schedules. One evening in late June, at around 9:45 p.m, George discovered Becky wasn't in her bed. Initially, he was more concerned about having to discipline his youngest than any supernatural implications. As a father of 4, George was well versed in the challenges of dealing with negative pushback from kids. Expecting to find her watching television with her mother or sisters, perhaps trying to stay up to watch Johnny Carson, he was concerned when she wasn't with them. Returning to her room, he called out for her, only to have her emerge from inside her closet. When questioned about why she wasn't in bed and what she was doing in the closet, Becky replied with childish innocence that she had been talking with the clown. George's mind raced through various possibilities as he examined the empty closet floor, looking for any sign of a doll or toy that might explain his daughter's statement. Finding nothing, he heard Becky casually announce, "Daddy, you scared him, he's gone," before cheerfully and casually climbing into bed. When George discussed the incident with his wife, they considered various rational explanations, from imaginary friends to an overactive imagination. They concluded that, while unusual, Becky didn't seem to be in any danger. 2 days later, George again found Becky in the closet at bedtime. Frustrated by this recurring behaviour, he attempted to explain to her that these nighttime closet visits needed to stop. However, what Becky revealed during their conversation sent chills down his spine. She explained that the clown had previously owned the house and harboured a particular dislike for her father. According to Becky, whenever George entered the room, the clown would walk through the closet wall. Most disturbing was Becky's final revelation. The clown had suggested they speak in the closet to avoid being overheard, and had predicted that George would eventually forbid their conversations. As George kissed his daughter's forehead and instructed her never to speak with the clown again, she simply smiled, nodded, and said, "He said that you would tell me this one day." That warm June evening, George asked his wife to join him on the back patio for a serious discussion. His wife, already convinced of supernatural activity, began researching the house's history. Her investigations took her to both the Oak Lawn and Green Hills libraries, though she discovered little beyond the town's name change from Worth to the friendly village of Worth in 1914. Her neighbours also didn't know a damn thing, and the mounting lack of information left her feeling increasingly hopeless. The situation reached new terrifying heights the following night. At 9:30 p.m, George went to check on Becky, finding her absent from her bed once again. This time, however, he heard something that froze him in place. 2 distinct voices coming from the closet, his daughter's and that of an adult male. As George stood paralysed, the hairs on the back of his neck rising, the closet door slowly opened about an inch on its own. Through the narrow gap, he glimpsed Becky sitting in the corner, far too distant to have opened the door herself. In that moment of horror, George realised his daughter couldn't have been the one to move the door. As this terrifying realisation struck him, the brightly shining closet light suddenly extinguished itself, plunging the space into darkness. Becky began screaming frantically in terror. George rushed in, grabbed his daughter, and fled downstairs, clutching her tightly to his chest. The commotion didn't settle until around 11 p.m. That night, the family sought refuge at their neighbour's house, while George, accompanied by the neighbour, Mark Romano, remained to keep watch. Throughout that sleepless night, as it wore on into the early hours, George and Mark sat at the kitchen table, discussing the events over beers until 4 a.m. Their conversation inevitably turned to ghosts, with George revealing he had never witnessed anything supernatural before, although now he admitted he had undeniably heard something that couldn't be explained. Mark shared what little he knew about the previous owners, a polite elderly couple, but had no knowledge of earlier residents or any rumours of hauntings. The following day brought another frightening incident when George's oldest daughter, returning from community college around noon, heard an ominous, disembodied laugh while in the bathroom. This event proved to be the final straw. The family took up full-time residence with their neighbours while George attempted to resolve the situation. George established an uncomfortable routine, visiting his family at the neighbour's house for about an hour each day before retreating to work in his garage. The burden of imposing on their neighbours weighed heavily on him, and an impending sense of doom clouded his thoughts. His wife urged him to contact the church, but George, feeling insecure about the situation, requested more time to consider their options. In 1977, resources for paranormal investigations were limited, and while paranormal research organisations existed in Oak Lawn, they weren't listed in the phone book. Without the internet, finding help proved challenging. The haunting culminated in a particularly terrifying encounter. One evening, after spending time with his family at the neighbour's house, George returned home. Feeling empty in his absent house, he turned on the television and began watching Westworld on WGN. About halfway through the film, around the scene where Yul Brynner's character malfunctions and begins his rampage on resort guests, George dozed off on the couch. He awakened to find himself in a state of sleep paralysis, experiencing the same threatening presence from his earlier nightmares, but this time targeting him directly. A massive weight pressed down on his chest, and his body felt as if it were encased in a wet sponge, preventing any movement. George tried to convince himself he was still dreaming until he managed to roll his eyes toward the TV, where he could see Yul Brynner chasing an unfortunate guest through underground hallways. He attempted to look at the clock, but couldn't move enough to see it. Throughout this paralysis, he had the distinct impression of a clown laughing at him, sitting on his chest. Later, George would struggle to determine whether he had actually seen the entity or merely sensed its presence. The oppressive experience finally broke when George became aware of heavy rain falling outside. Suddenly released from the paralysis, he shot up from the couch, breathing heavily and still dazed. But something had changed within him. The fear that had dominated his experience was giving way to an unprecedented rage. George felt something snap inside him as he contemplated everything he had lost. His family displaced, his home compromised, his peace shattered. Consumed by this newfound anger, George began a violent room-by-room frenzy through the empty house. He slammed doors, punched walls, and screamed obscenities at the top of his lungs, challenging the unseen entity that had invaded his home. The exact duration of his outburst remained unclear to him, but eventually, exhausted and thirsty from shouting, he made his way to the kitchen for a beer. Opening the back door, George stood watching the thunderstorm, finding a moment of peace. But this calm was short-lived, as a creeping sensation of pure fear began to overtake him. He felt a presence closing in, and the terrible realization that he might have pushed too far began to dawn on him. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his garage equipment activating, the air compressor pounding and the sander rattling. Between lightning flashes, George noticed movement through the rhombus-shaped service door window of his garage. What had initially appeared as a pitch-black void soon revealed something far more terrifying. Illuminated by lightning, George finally saw his unwanted guest, a white face with a red nose, yellow hair arranged in two triangular jets on either side of a bald head, and most disturbingly, black voids where eyes should have been. As George processed this horrifying sight, a sinister shrieking laugh filled the air, igniting pure terror in his heart. The sound was so hideous it literally turned him white with fear. Trembling uncontrollably, George fled to his neighbour's house. When he finally managed to speak coherently, he described the terrifying encounter to Mark. Determined to investigate, Mark decided to inspect the house himself, despite the late hour and the continuing storm. Upon entering the house, Mark found it exactly as George had left it, lights blazing, television still on, and the back door standing open. He thoroughly checked the first floor, though unsure exactly what he was looking for. Just as he was beginning to question the futility of his inspection, he moved to close the back door and shut off the kitchen lights. As he crossed from the linoleum floor to the carpeted dining area, an unmistakable sound came from upstairs. The distinct sound of water hitting a rug drew his attention to the second floor. Given the thunderstorm raging outside, Mark reasoned that an open window was allowing rain to enter. Being a pragmatic man with no personal experience of the supernatural and maintaining a healthy skepticism, he felt no fear as he climbed the stairs to investigate. On the second floor, he quickly located the source of the sound behind a door decorated with graded kindergarten papers bearing Becky's name. As he stood there, Mark began to process the significance of this detail. The presence seemed particularly drawn to Becky's room. Despite this realisation, he grabbed the handle and entered. As expected, he found a window open on the far wall and walked casually toward it. The moment he reached the window, however, the atmosphere in the room changed dramatically. A sudden, overwhelming sensation of dread and hopelessness washed over him. He felt an uncontrollable pressure against his mind, as if some foreign consciousness were pressing against his thoughts. Mark began scanning the room nervously, expecting to be struck at any moment by an invisible force. His instincts screamed at him to close the window and leave immediately. As he turned to exit, his attention was drawn to the closet, though he couldn't recall if it had been open when he entered the room. What he saw made his blood run cold. Everything seemed to have taken on a black and white quality, and within the closet was the presence of an impossible blackness. Paralysed with fear, Mark watched as the dark entity began to fold in on itself and grow larger. The silence was broken by a rustling sound, spurring him into action. Without looking back at the closet, he retreated into the hallway. Halfway down the stairs, he heard Becky's door slam with a violent force. Mark broke into a full sprint toward the front door, all the while aware of the same unsettling darkness creeping into the corners of his vision. Just steps from escape, an inhuman voice screamed, "Get out, now!" The sound was unlike anything produced by human vocal cords. Within seconds, Mark was outside, vowing never to set foot in that house again. Meeting George on the front lawn, away from his family's ears and in the pouring rain, Mark delivered his urgent advice with grave sincerity. Get your family out of that hellhole. Taking his neighbour's warning to heart, George acted swiftly. Within a week, he had invited the local pastor to the house. 2 days after that, a team of parapsychologists arrived to investigate. By the beginning of the following week, the family had moved out completely. The house remained on the market for several months before another family purchased it. Curiously, the neighbourhood never heard rumours of the haunting, and Becky retained no memory of her conversations with the clown. The new family reported no encounters with the entity that had terrorised the family before it. George later mentioned that an exorcism had been performed, though whether it proved successful or not, he left that decision for others to make. This account comes directly from Mark Romano, who witnessed these events firsthand as the neighbour who lived through this terrifying ordeal. As he notes, for skeptics who simply state that the paranormal doesn't exist, for Mark, this case stands as undeniable personal evidence of how narrow such thinking can be. The true mystery, he suggests, lies in understanding how these energies manifest and draw power. He observes that most encounters seem to tap into a particular aspect of human consciousness, whether it be an emotion or a belief, leaving us vulnerable. While the exact nature of the entity, whether it was truly the spirit of a former resident manifesting as a clown or something more sinister assuming that form, remains unknown, the undeniable impact on the family who lived at the property, along with their neighbour, stands as compelling evidence of an encounter with something profoundly terrifying and mysterious during that summer of 1977.